Hello and welcome to Living Spark, a project of the Spark of Humanity Network. I'm going to host this session. I'm Daniela O'Hallisey, and it's brought to you from the West Coast through the genius of the good people at Onion River Community Access. That's Orca Media in Montpelier, Vermont. I will be repeatedly thanking them for their help with this. The Spark of Humanity Network has, at sparkofhumanity.net, has a sort of mission statement or a sort of inspirational statement. I try to read a little bit of it at the beginning of each session to remind us what it is we're trying to do. And then I'll talk about my own experience, my own reason for being here, and some thoughts and experiences. But please, if you're watching this now live on Orca Media or YouTube or Zoom, then certainly you can reach us. There's a phone number on your screen. Please call in or please message on Zoom if that's where you are. Anyway, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Spark of Humanity right now. In everyone we meet, in everyone we think of, there is a spark of humanity. In us too, regardless of how defended or distorted or baffled, all sparks are made of the same stuff. Sparks have a natural affinity for one another. And when you, through your spark, connect with and affirm the spark in another, regardless of how defended or distorted or baffled they are, their spark is strengthened. That changes things. So yes, I came to the Spark of Humanity, the Spark practice, about a year ago. I started watching Martha Holden's broadcast in the same time slot that was called Living Mosaic. And I joined her frequently and listened and learned, and I always made myself, challenged myself to actually try to put the stuff in practice as I experienced it. If you were here last week, or if you've seen it in between then and now, you will remember that I was talking about blame and about how we often defend ourselves by blaming others. And one of the examples, because I've experienced it personally, but I've also done it to others, and so it's one of the ones that comes up very quickly for me, is the blame that we give or receive around medical stuff. That's just sort of, it's a safe topic for me to talk about. I don't want to get into heavy stuff right now. It's not what I'm doing yet. But yeah, the way that someone has lung cancer or has cancer in general, and the first thing we ask is, are they a smoker? What kind of food do they eat? We look for fault in them, and it's such a safe and obvious example because we look for fault in them to protect ourselves. If you're a heavy smoker and you get cancer, and I'm not a heavy smoker, then I can go, I don't have to worry about that one. So that's the one that I often come back to just to communicate this. Blame is everywhere. I talked last week about the wildfires out here in Southern California and about how I watched people blame diversity in the fire department, LA Fire Department on the one hand, and other people saying, it's global warming or it's lack of federal funding, whatever. I try to represent as balanced of a perspective as I can, especially when something is clearly, for reasons that don't make any sense, divided along political lines. I mean, in that case, with fires, they're tragedies no matter who you are. And there are ways to alter the response to the fires or the preparedness for fires. And there are longer term things like talking about climate change and talking about how that is impacting, making the Santa Ana winds worse, a lot worse. And from that, creating conditions that are ripe for extremely bad fire. Anyway, that again, it's been politicized. I don't see it as a political thing, but it's been politicized. So I tiptoe around it, but in my tiptoeing, I do try to look at both sides of that and try to see where, when, how each might have a a point about something. Watch that episode if you haven't seen it. It's called Blame. It's on the Orca Media account on YouTube. Anyway, um, I gave myself the homework assignment to look for people in my life that I am blaming for things, or look for um, situations that I blame on, I don't know, my computer. My dog ate my homework, my computer broke, whatever. Just look for things that represent that defendedness, that confusion that we were just talking about in the mission statement, that way that I'm defending myself from more often than not, non-existent threats. And oh God, the instant I said it and the minute we signed off, I've sat for 2 weeks with two people in mind that I blame for things that happened in their lives. And for my, again, if you're new, you won't necessarily know that my Momo the cat is always with me. And so you're going to hear noise. Occasionally the camera will wiggle because she likes to find it and play with it because she knows I'm looking at it. Anyway, sorry about that. So yeah, these two people were people that I profoundly loved. I love them still, but they have passed. And it's hard for me to talk about, but I'm going to try. Yeah, I'm going to try. When I was young, you see all these guitars back here. I'm noticing that this one has a broken string, which I feel very embarrassed to have on screen there. But yeah, I play guitar. I've taken it very seriously through my life, and one of my guitar heroes was a man named Larry Coryell. That in the 70s, when I was a teenager, the music of of people who perceived ourselves as brilliant or whatever. We were probably pretentious as much as anything else. But the music that I loved that really meant the most to me was called fusion. It had first been called jazz rock, and then it was called jazz fusion. It's still called that. It goes through a few other names. But anyway, very powerful, very intellectually challenging, sometimes rich music. And one of the people that set my hair on fire back then and just lit my soul was a man named Larry Coryell. And years later, 10 years ago, yeah, 10 years ago or so, maybe 15, I thought, wouldn't it be great to take lessons with him? Like I'd heard that he gives private lessons, and I thought, I don't know how that could work because he lived in Florida and I lived in Vermont at the time. But I managed to connect with him, and we did Zoom, not Zoom. It wasn't Zoom then, it was Skype. We did our lessons over Skype. We did meet in person a couple of times. I went to shows of his, and he changed my life. I mean, it was amazing to have a hero like that to sit with and talk about music and to get inspired in a very personal, direct way. Larry was a very generous teacher, and with his time, he was generous, and with his insights and with the inspiration. Sometimes my 1 hour lesson went 2 hours or more, and that was just amazing. He'd had some health problems, some pretty big health problems, and I was invited to come to a show he was doing in New York City, but it was kind of a last minute invitation. It was not practical at all for me, and so I didn't go. And then he died. He died that while he was in New York. And I found out that everyone that was around him knew that he was having heart problems. He kept talking about his heart problem. Like he didn't call it that, but he's like, I'm having trouble breathing. I have this heaviness in my chest. And he apparently wouldn't go to the hospital and have it looked at, was insistent that he was going to go and do this show and that he was going to be okay. It wasn't just denial, but I have blamed him for participating and for being involved with, a really lovely Buddhist sect, by the way, that that were wonderful people. It's just that sometimes there was a denial in the group, that there was a feeling like if you're having a really bad health problem, you can chant a lot and you'll be okay. And Larry had chanted his way out of drug addiction and had been clean for 30 years. It was no small force in his life. And when I look at it fully, I'm keenly aware of that fact. Um, at the time, though, when he died, and when I heard the full story, I started to judge him. I started to blame him for his own death. And what a selfish thing. I was blaming him for dying, and that took the form of me feeling a kind of petulant anger inside of myself. It took a very long time for me to realize that I was also blaming myself. That if I had read other people's minds, read his mind, and known that the invitation to come to the show was around what people wanting to keep an eye on his health. I keep telling myself that I would have gone in that case, but I'm not sure I would have. And if I had gone, I'm pretty sure I would have kept my mouth shut when he complained about his health, because I would have been, I don't know, in too much in awe of him or something. Anyway, I did say there were two people, and the other story is somewhat similar. I may tell it in the future, but that turns out to be the story that I've looked at it over the past 2 weeks, and I first of all remembered that sense of blame that I had at the time, and I've then moved on to analyzing it and breaking it down and remembering how much I love and miss this guy, and then facing the fact that I have also blamed myself, and that dirty snowball of blame is it's not helpful. It's a way that I'm trying to defend myself from the grief of having briefly been friends with a powerfully wonderful, gifted, profoundly gifted genius who changed the music world and who told me I was pretty good at music, and inspired me to kind of return to music after a long break from it. Um, yeah. So that's the blame piece of this, and that's something that will. I think that work has been so difficult for me that it will stay with me, and I hope to see it. I hope to continue it, because I need to look for little ways that I blame others, that I blame myself, and the ways that when we blame ourselves, we immediately leap to defending ourselves, and that is like defending our spark in the language of this practice. It is a way that we close ourselves off from our spark. And as I'm trying to open myself, it's going to be an ongoing process to think about this. Am I blaming someone? Am I blaming myself? Am I blaming my computer keyboard? Like, keep those things in mind. And keep in mind the futility of it, that the underlying thing is that I'm trying to defend myself from vulnerability, which is wasted time. So today I'm going to start off with this new topic with a little bit of a hopefully funny story, or I don't know, we'll see. Back when I was first left home, I was living in the big city. I moved to Boston, and I was driving. Boston traffic is notorious for the getting cut off or all that kind of stuff. And I was driving a lot and learning to drive in that situation, whereas I'd driven on very gentle roads back where I lived. Um, and I started to kind of apropos of nothing, that whole setup wasn't really the point, but it would be my context, this frustration and mild fear and anxiety while I was driving. And I started to notice bumper stickers. And the ones that really stood out for me were the ones that said things like "Save the Whales" or "Free Tibet." There's a dozen others. I wrote some more down. Yeah, "End World Hunger" is the other one that I'd written down. it was the globalized imperative almost that automatically made me I would just anyone in the car would go like, what are you talking about? I'd say, I can't. And then we'd have that conversation like, what are you talking about? Save the whales. I can't save the whales. I can't end world hunger. I can't free Tibet. And it was never really funny, but it was a jokey way of protecting myself from this sense of responsibility, this outsized thing that was like the imperative. It was, I guess, is what I was reacting to. I did eventually come to the conclusion that if it were a poster rather than a bumper sticker that said, do something about world hunger, I could have thought about doing something practical, donating some money, donating some time, some effort. But when it was end world hunger, that is not something that I can do. And so it always built a wall around that for me. Eventually, I came across a poster, saw a bumper sticker that said, visualize world peace. Visualize world peace. And those first ones to me were like, they were like a solid wall, the Great Wall of China, but right behind it was a cliff. And at the top of that cliff was Mount Everest, which geographically is wrong. But the point being that there was this impenetrable barrier in front of me when given those, you do this thing that is completely outside of your capability. But suddenly visualize world peace. That was a challenge because I knew that visualization was within my power. And therefore, every time I see that, I kind of go, but I can't. Well, yeah, I can, right? I can kind of do it. I can kind of visualize world peace. But as long as I was seeing it as extrinsic, you know, um, uh, do something about hunger is not the same as end world hunger. End world hunger sounds like I have to, I don't know what, I have to change the world outside of myself in some way that's outside of my control. I said that already, but I'm just trying to bring it back to the extrinsic nature of these commands versus visualize is a thing that a person can do or can at least try to do. Now, in Buddhism, they talk about habits of body, speech, and mind. That's always said in that order. Um, and I've noted that since I've heard that, I've noted that, yeah, the things I do in the world affect the way I talk about the world, affect the way I think about the world, but then my thoughts impact my speech, which impacts my behavior. It's sort of a cycle, worth thinking about, worth visualizing if you get a chance. The the struggle here is how to visualize world peace. I mean, I've had violence inflicted upon me, direct violence at me. I have mentioned being a trans woman. You'll hear it again. Maybe eventually I'll tell some more personal stories, but just in that light, I've experienced true violence against myself. I've also had people that I love get killed. I also have had people, who've been robbed, all of the nasty things, and we all watch the news. We all see what's going on in the world. Um, the so the conundrum is, how do you visualize world peace when you can visualize, maybe I find I can visualize myself having a peaceful response, or at least a non-body response, not physically striking back, and not a non-speech response. I'm not going to try to incite others to violence or whatever. And I can maybe even say I can put it out of mind, which isn't the same as having peace in my mind. But I don't know how to deal with that guy that hit me with a baseball bat. I don't know how to even think about dealing with him or dealing with that situation. Still visualize world peace. You can visualize. So then I go to the extrinsic and I try to picture a world in which, a world in which all violence stops. But that isn't really peace, is it? I mean, um, frankly, the song Imagine by John Lennon is probably the best visualization of peace I've ever heard. And Give Peace a Chance by John Lennon, another one. I mean, the guy ended up shot dead on the street. And so it's easy for me to be cynical about world peace, very hard to visualize. Visualizing it as a sort of fantasy experience, clouds, angels, harps, yeah, I can kind of do that. So that the struggle has been to do this. I'm going to try to tell you a quick story. I don't remember all the details of this, but after apartheid ended in South Africa, there was a Truth and Reconciliation Committee, I believe it was called. The idea was to negotiate peace between people who had been enemies. And the story that comes to mind that was told me was of a woman whose son had been murdered by by the police. And I'm choking up because I'm trying to imagine if that ever happened to me with one of my kids. And yet, a Black woman who had been, put down, who had been held down under apartheid, and a white police officer who killed her son. And the commission came up with the solution, and she agreed to it, that this cop who had done this became her son. That she wouldn't have to grow old alone, that she would have someone who cared for her and cared about her. I can't imagine how she did it. The story is that she did it and they came to love each other. I don't know how she did it. But anyway, yes, that's a story to talk about visualizing world peace. That's a story that we can hope to be able to emulate. And I will tell you that I tried to visit the guy in prison who attacked me, and was detained from that. I think he didn't want to see me, so I was unable to do it. That was my vain attempt at living that out. But anyway, yeah, sorry I got choked up on you, but the point is that without facing those things in some way, without having some tangible example of how do people find inner peace, we can't imagine world peace, but we can continue to work with that as a sort of mantra. Ask yourself, don't tell yourself, don't be imperative with yourself, don't be imperative with others, don't be self-righteous, don't beat yourself up because you can't do it today, but in every small way that you can, visualize world peace. That's my homework for myself for the next 2 weeks. And that is the homework that I hope that you will share with me. To give one more really quick example, because I have a very brief amount of time, I remember reading that Mahatma Gandhi, during a time when there was great civil unrest, India had just been freed from the British Empire, but were facing all-out civil war, and certain provinces in the north were populated by Islamic people, and the rest of the country was populated by Hindus. And Gandhi walked a highway along that border, knowing that him being a Hindu, he knew that the Hindu people would protect him, but he also knew that the Muslims would have to, because the country would erupt into war if he were killed, and they would be seen as the enemy. And he successfully completed that walk. Yeah, do your best to visualize world peace. This has brought up a lot for me. It's been a challenging one. I couldn't even start thinking about it until a half hour before we went on air. I knew what I was going to talk about, but I wasn't internally prepared for this. So I've been your host, Danielle O'Hallisey. Please join us, sparkofhumanity.net. Please throw your love at Orca Media, and please keep your faith and keep working on visualizing peace. Thank you.